Hi, and thanks for joining us for another of our NWBA midweek reflections. I realise that for many of us, the last few months will not have been easy for all kinds of reasons. But I suspect too that for all of that, many of us will have taken advantage of these seasons of lockdown to maybe get on with things and to catch up with stuff that we've previously been putting off. And that's certainly been true in our household. And one thing in particular, especially during the summer months, was getting out into the garden and doing some serious pruning and cutting back of some of our shrubs and our bushes. Over the years, they've just kind of quietly got bigger and bigger, and particularly in the front garden, it was really only when we cut them back that we began to realise just how overgrown they had become. And I've got to admit that my wife Jan is a lot braver than I am in this respect. And in some cases, when she'd finished, all we really seemed to have was a stump or a few twigs and branches that were left. And of course, then comes the job of getting all the stuff that you've cut off down to the local refuse site and into the recycling system, which is easier said than done because trips there now have to be pre-booked and socially distanced. And so it really mattered that I got everything in one trip. And as I was trying to get it all into the car, I kind of realised that actually there was far more of those bushes that was being carted away than what we'd actually got left. But 3 months or so later, it's what was left that has proved to me to be what really mattered. Because sure enough, if you go out and look at those same plants now in our garden, you can already see new buds and new shoots beginning to grow, and in some cases they've developed already a fair display of new leaves. So for all that the bulk of the plant did indeed end up in a skip and has no doubt been ground into compost by now, the life is in what remains. And I sense that within that is an echo of what many of us have actually experienced in recent months. You know, we too might feel that huge swathes of our lives have been chopped away. That might be the regular activities of our local church and Christian community. It might be our family life as we've been prevented from being with those that we love, or at least being with them anything like as much as we're used to. It could even be something as simple as going shopping, which is no longer a nice stroll to the supermarket and a wander around the special offer shelves and maybe a trip to the coffee shop while we're there. Now it's just a sort of in and out, socially distanced, click and collect, and off you go. So much of what we do and what we are has just been stripped back to the bare minimum, so to speak. But if we think about that in relation to our faith, then perhaps the image of those garden plants of mine has something to say to us. You know, one thing you discover when you begin to read the narratives of our scriptures is that there is no shortage of gardening metaphors within them. And so just in case you haven't worked it out already, we're going to look at one of those in a few moments in this particular reflection. Now, to make sense of this, perhaps we need to do a little bit of homework first, because I want to point out that not all of those metaphors are just random illustrations. And in particular, I want us to recognize that the vine or the vineyard is often used in the narratives of our Bible as a symbol of the nation of Israel, the community of God's people. That very much originates from the writings of the prophet Isaiah, one of those who could at times speak very powerfully to challenge the behaviours and the values of the people of God, but who at other times could speak tremendous messages of hope in the midst of situations of despair. And it's in the writings of the prophet Isaiah that we detect many of the historic prophecies that speak of the coming of Jesus. Isaiah was also a very poetic writer at times, and one of the oracles that he wrote has become known as the Song of the Vineyard. I will sing a song for the one I love, he says, a song about his vineyard. And Isaiah goes on to equate his own people as being like a vine or a vineyard that has become diseased and corrupted and will eventually be laid waste. And it's from oracles like this that the image of God's people being like a vine or a vineyard developed. And why this is of particular relevance to us is because I want us to look together at some words of Jesus which begin with him saying, I am the true vine. And when we recognize the context of statements like that, we begin to realize the true force of their meaning, because Jesus is not just making a statement about gardening, he's making a political statement. And we find this particular statement in John's Gospel, chapter 15. But before we read it, let's say something too about the circumstances in which Jesus is speaking here. You know, many of us may well be feeling deeply troubled by all that is going on around us at the moment. And it's interesting that the chapter immediately preceding this one begins with the words, let not your hearts be troubled. Jesus is speaking to a group of people who were deeply troubled. And as we pull the lens back further, so to speak, we can see that they had good reason to be troubled, because all of this conversation takes place on the night that Jesus was betrayed, the day before he will eventually be subjected to a show trial before being executed by the Roman authorities. And his close companions can feel events closing in on them, and they were afraid and they were disturbed about what was happening. And Jesus then goes on to speak and outlines a reality that they just didn't want to hear. This was not going to be some passing crisis that they would all get over and then be able to sort of hit the reset button and get everything back to normal. This was a sequence of events that would permanently change things. And one of the key things that was troubling the companions of Jesus is that he was speaking openly and honestly about the fact that he would be going away from them. Their relationship with him was going to become very different. And although at one level the circumstances were quite different to our own, I sense that Jesus was speaking to a group of people whose experience of those circumstances would not be that different to many of the emotions that we might be experiencing at the moment. So let's remember those two things. Remember the meaning of this term vine, and also remember the circumstances in which Jesus was speaking as we look together at what he says. And so I'm going to read from John's Gospel, chapter 15, and I'm going to read verses 1 to 5. And this is what it says. Jesus is speaking here. I am the true vine, and my Father is the gardener. He cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit, while every branch that does bear fruit he prunes, so that it will be even more fruitful. You are already clean because of the word I have spoken to you. Remain in me, as I also remain in you. No branch can bear fruit by itself, it must remain in the vine. And neither can you bear fruit unless you remain in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. Now, Jesus carries this on a bit further, so you may want to read a little bit more of that if you want to, but I simply want to draw three things out of what Jesus says here that might offer us some hope and assurance as we confront our present realities. Now, as I outlined earlier, Jesus is speaking here about identity. He is speaking to a group of people who would have been brought up to believe that their identity as the people of God rested on their racial heritage. You are God's people because you were born into the right family and you follow the right rules. That's the kind of narrative that his listeners would have grown up with. And Jesus says, no, I've come to establish a new covenant. You are God's people because I am the vine, not the nation. And you are the branches, and you are God's people because you remain in me. But that might well be a challenging experience, because he then speaks of this vine being pruned and cut. And going back to what I was saying at the beginning, that can often be a dramatic experience. Our garden looked dramatically different when we'd finished with it. And Jesus makes a very subtle but a very significant distinction. Some of these branches will just be cut off. They have no part in the vine. Others will be pruned. They too will be cut back, but cut back so that they can grow stronger and cleaner, and through that bear even greater fruit. Now, I suspect that when many of us look at the world around us at the moment, we might well feel that we're being bombarded by all the same struggles and challenges as everybody else. And if I'm honest, I'm intrigued by those Christians who somehow expect our faith to mean anything else. Because time and time again, the narratives of the New Testament make clear to us that the road of faith is a narrow and difficult one. And as I mentioned earlier, Jesus is not speaking into some theoretical vacuum here. In just a few hours, he will quite literally be taking up the cross to fulfill God's purposes of salvation. And I guess it isn't too difficult to describe a lot of our recent experiences as being a bit like pruning. That was the kind of parallel that I was drawing earlier. And I sense that in the months and the years ahead, we might find it very tempting to try and find and reclaim all of those things that have been stripped back in recent times. But the image that Jesus offers is of new life and new growth out of what remains, not to be found in what is now the garden waste pile. And I sense that there is really a challenge in that, but also an encouragement in what Jesus says. I am the vine. Remain in me. Whatever has been stripped away has been stripped away. But what matters is that we cling fast to our identity in Christ. There's a reason why those pruned stumps are starting to show new signs of life again. And it's quite simply because they have remained rooted in the ground. It doesn't matter how much of the plant was cut out and carted away. It's what remains rooted that matters. And Jesus says exactly the same here. Stay rooted. Remain in me. So that's maybe the first thing that we can take from this, just an invitation to say, look, whatever else is going on, whatever else is being taken away from us at the moment, stay rooted in Christ. And the second thing I want us to notice is that qualifying phrase, I am the vine, my Father is the gardener. Now, a gardener may well be someone who does cut back and prune plants, but they don't do that as an end in itself. They don't go around cutting back branches because they just like cutting back branches. They don't do it for fun. They have a purpose. They have a future in mind. They are seeking to help those plants remain healthy, to fulfill their purpose, and to remain a thing of beauty or usefulness in the seasons ahead, and to make them strong so that they can bear fruit, not just bear foliage. So when we see a plant that's been pruned, it might look like a shadow of its former self. We might even be stunned by its immediate plight. But it's evidence that a gardener has been at work, someone who has a purpose for that plant. And I wonder whether we might draw some assurances from perceiving of our present circumstances in that light. My Father is the gardener, says Jesus. You're not just caught up in a series of random events. You're not just being vandalized. You're not the helpless victims of circumstance. My Father has a purpose. Now, that doesn't mean that at times the impact of events might not be startling and unsettling. It was a shock for us to see all our garden plants cut back the way they were, but there was a purpose, there was a plan, and we are already seeing signs of future fruitfulness and growth because of that. So let's remember that God, the Father, is indeed the gardener in this illustration. And the third thing we might notice, as I've already alluded to, is that the purpose of this pruning is to bear fruit. You know, I remember hearing someone talk about these words of Jesus who lived quite near to a vineyard, and they made the point that you don't grow grapevines because they're pretty. In fact, most grapevines are pretty ugly, wiry looking things if you ever go to a vineyard, or at least the ones that grow decent grapes are. They're not grown for their looks, they're grown for their fruit. And perhaps there are circumstances and experiences that we too need to face and find a way through so that we can live fruitful lives. And perhaps the question that we need to be asking ourselves in these difficult times is, how can I remain fruitful? So maybe you could spend a little bit of time reflecting on these words of Jesus for yourself. And as ever, I just invite you to find some space where you can do that. And again, if you can, find a companion or a group of people that maybe you can think about these things through together with. And I just offer you those three things to consider. Firstly, what do I just need to let go of? Life has been pruned. And when we do that to plants, we particularly look for the diseased and the damaged branches to cut away. And now, I'm not making any judgments here, but things may have been dramatic and unexpected in recent months. But what do we now need to be content to release? And what is it that truly matters in what remains? I think that's going to be an important decision for many of us to make, both as individuals and church communities in the days ahead. And as I said earlier, there was no point for me to cling to all those cut off branches, because that wasn't where the future lay. The question we need to ask is, how do I stay rooted in these challenging times? And the second question is therefore, maybe what might God's purpose be? Now, again, I want to avoid narratives that rush to assume what may or may not be caused by God. But what we can be certain of is that God has a purpose for each of us. And sometimes that purpose may be accomplished through events, and sometimes by remaining strong in the face of events. But perhaps we all need to be seeking God at the moment and considering, what is God's purpose for my life? I guess that this whole pandemic has made many of us just stop in our tracks and ask questions about our values and our direction and all kinds of things. And it seems to me that as followers of Jesus, a key part of that question is, what is God's purpose for my life? What is God's purpose for his church? What is God's purpose for our world? And how can we play our part in pursuing God's purposes and not just be driven along by agendas of our own making? And then finally, how can I remain fruitful? What are the fruits that God desires of me? You know, there are several places in our scriptures where that is outlined in general terms, but perhaps also reflect on what that means for you as an individual. What is the fruit of my life? What does God want the fruit of my life to be? What needs to change? What needs to remain in the light of that? So I hope that these words spoken by Jesus to a group of very troubled and very uncertain followers might offer you some hope and assurance as you remain in him, as you trust God's purposes, and as you seek to bear good fruit in these present times. Thanks for listening.